Hey, it's David. Recently I did a video on how to clean and maintain the front brake on the KTM 390. Today I want to just finish that cycle off by looking at the rear brake on the 390 Duke. Now the rear brake's very simple, it's very similar to the front brake, just a slightly different layout. Now rear brake's always much smaller, much less powerful because most of the braking is with the front brake. So stock system's pretty good. Again, it's a bi-brie rear brake unit, but this time on the back it's a floating caliper. If you can imagine, you've got the brake disc is here and the caliper sits over it. But on one side you've got a fixed pad, and on the other side you've got a pad that's got a piston behind it. On the front brake there are pistons both sides. On the rear brake there's only a piston on one side. And what that means is when you press the rear brake, the piston pushes the pad out until it touches the disc. The piston keeps on going out, but now because it's hit the disc, it slides the whole caliper over until the other pad hits, and then both act as braking. That's one of the reasons why the back brake is not as powerful as the front brake, but it doesn't need to be because it locks up the rear wheel really easily. But you want to not only make sure that the pads are in good condition, but you also want to make sure that that caliper is still sliding properly as it should. Because if it isn't, then you're only ever going to get 50% of your braking because only one pad is going to touch. And then it's not going to really brake very well at all because it needs to squeeze it with the two pads to actually work properly. Now, if you do find that is a problem, then you'll have to take the whole brake unit off, and that means taking the rear wheel out, which I'm not going to show you in this one because that's slightly more involved. So let's get into it. Unless you're changing brake pads, you should never top up this. If this needs topping up and your brake pads are still okay, you've got a problem because you've got a leak and you need to fix that. Now, to take the cap off, you first need to remove the little lock, and that's just a little 7mm. So screw comes out and the little locking plate comes out with it, and then you can unscrew the cap and it will come off. But we also need to take out the little reservoir cap, and as with the front brake, what we don't want to do is to turn that upside down. So what we want to do is to take it out and keep it that way up. Be very careful not to drip any of this fluid onto the bike because it will strip the paint off because it's .4. So if you do that, make sure you rinse it off with water. Coming to the back brake, the setup is very similar. We've got these pins which will pull out to allow the pads to come out. But one thing to note is that the pin comes out this way. So if the spoke's in the way, then you're going to have to move the bike a little. To make sure you've got clearance to take it out. Now, first thing we want to do though is to push that piston back in so that we've got a little bit of room. I can see by looking up that way the open brake master cylinder, and as I push this in, I'm going to be pushing fluid back in there, so I want to make sure that it doesn't overflow at any point. So really it's sort of a rocking motion. If you're replacing the pads at this point, then you really need to move those pistons, or that piston, all the way back in. Once you're happy with it, you just need to pull these pins. With the R-clips out the way, then the pin will slide out, and then you'll be able to pull these out. Looking at these are again a sintered pad. What do we got? It says bi-brie. This doesn't say Brembo on it, but it's a sintered pad. Certainly I've had no issues with that. Again, the wear is 1mm. I have plenty of wear on this. If I pull out the pad on this side, with these, the first pad that hits will always wear more than the second pad, and you can see that here. This pad has more pad on it than this one, but still more than enough for what's needed, so they're all good. So I can put those back in, and now we can get in here and clean. You can use hot soapy water. I like to make sure that you've got plenty of cloths here, because I don't really like brake cleaner on paint, but you can get in there with a toothbrush, soft brush, whatever, and clean as much as you can. Really, you're not going to get a lot of cleaning done like this, so the best way is getting the rear wheel out the way. With the rear wheel out the way, the brake disc will be that way, and you can get in there. Now at this point you might want to pump the piston out a little bit, and in so doing that will allow you to clean the piston, but then you've got to remember that you've got to push that piston back in, so you've got to have a way of doing that. Sometimes you can do it just manually by moving the caliper. Sometimes you need to use a tool, as I showed last time, to push that piston back into its home here. When I say a floating caliper, this is what I mean. So the caliper floats. So what happens is you've got a pad here, and you've got a pad the other side here. When you squeeze the brake lever, the piston moves out. It pushes this pad against the disc. Piston keeps pushing out, and as it does, it moves the caliper across and brings the pad on this side in contact with the disc, and then they both brake on the disc. It's a very basic setup, but it works perfectly well for a rear brake. So get in there, clean those as much as you can, make sure that that caliper moves, make sure that when you do this that boot down here goes back on properly, and that's pretty much it. So get in there, clean it. If your pads are down to 1 mil, and that'll be the one on this side, then you need to change it. Otherwise we can put them back in, and the bike will be back and ready to go. The brake master cylinder has got enough fluid in it to allow for the pads getting down to minimum. So you shouldn't top up the brake fluid during the life of the pads, basically, unless you're replacing the fluid. And if you do replace the fluid, remember, if your pads are part worn, you shouldn't fill the master cylinder up to the max line, because otherwise when you do this and you push those pads back in, it'll push the fluid back up the line here into the master cylinder and overflow it. I'm going to carry on and clean this bit better without my camera being in the way, and then it's time to put it back together. Putting it back together is really simple. So we take our brake pads and we slide them into place. Make sure that's properly seated there. And this one as well. So clean the pads if they need it. Make sure that seats at the back properly. Take your pin. You need to clean this off. Don't scratch at it with anything abrasive, because you will take the plating off, and if the plating wears off, which it will do sooner or later, then it becomes difficult to get in and out. So slide that back in. And with that fully in, you can now put your R-clips back in. I find if you put this front one in first, then it's easier to control the direction of the second one, because the second one will hit the inside of the caliper if you don't have it at the right angle, and this allows you to rotate it until you find an angle that you can put it in properly. So I say, if it's at the wrong angle, you won't be able to get it in So like that, we're on there. Next thing we want to do is to put the cap back onto the reservoir. So again, don't forget, if you get any spillage here, clean it up, clean it off with water. Cap back on. The locking clip back in place. Don't over tighten it, it's only a tiny little bolt. Final thing we want to do is just to check that you've got free play in your brake lever here. I think it's about 5 to 10 mil off the top of my head. If that doesn't have clearance in it, then it can affect your braking. Then what we want to do is just pump that up. Because you've pushed the piston back, we need to push the piston back out again, as we did with the front, so that the rear wheel can now brake properly. So make sure that's fully pumped up, then you're ready to go. What I suggest you do is, when you take the bike out, which you should now do just to test the back brake is all set up and working properly, is just make sure that brakes properly before you go out into a road situation. And that's it. That's all that's involved in routine rear brake maintenance and changing pads. Just remember, if you are changing pads, that you need to get that piston push back inside. But before you do that, give it a good clean around to get rid of all the dirt. What you don't want to be doing is pushing that piston back in and taking all the dirt into the seals with it. Ideally, I would say, if you are changing the pads, think about taking the rear wheel out so that you can get in there and clean inside there properly before you do that. So make sure that caliper slides. If it doesn't, then you'll have to actually take the rear wheel out, clean up the caliper where it's, have a look at the sliding pins, get it nice and clean, make sure it does slide backwards and forwards, because if it doesn't slide backwards and forwards easily and well, then your rear brake performance is going to be badly compromised. Rear brake maintenance is really simple and easy to do, and it's very important in order to keep on top of your rear brake. If you're having any issues with the rear brake, like it's not working properly, then follow this process and find out where the problem is. And in my experience, it will often be that the caliper isn't sliding, so it's actually frozen in place and needs to be taken apart and cleaned, lubricated and put back together. Very often it's caused on an older caliper by corrosion on the pins where it slides. So sort it out, and it's a simple system, really easy to do, so you shouldn't have too much trouble with it. So good luck with that.